Doing great. Got a story out of Investopedia, and this is not good for the banks. This is going to add a ton more pressure. Story is wild. And if you think for a second that the Fed wants to keep these smaller banks in business, I think that you are gravely mistaken. I think the Fed wants consolidation. They want to see more banks go out of business and be bought up for pennies on the dollar, their assets from the big banks, the banks that own the Federal Reserve, because the Federal Reserve is a private bank. It is not federal and it has no reserves. It has the ability to print money. We have kicked two central banks out of our country prior to the formation of the Federal Reserve. And this third time was the charm. They snuck right back into the country. And it's actually crazy. You think just a couple years later, income tax came about. And I believe that the Federal Reserve played a huge part in that. Here we go. This story is out of, sorry if I'm congested, so sorry if my voice is a little off. This story is out of Investopedia. It's entitled U.S. Regulators Unveil New Rules Targeting Regional Banks. It says regional lenders could be required to hold more long-term debt as a cushion in the event of failure. And as we read this, I want you to think about these regulations are not so that it helps the bank, so that it will prevent it from failing. Check this out. It says the U.S. financial regulators from the FDIC, OCC, Treasury Department, and the Federal Reserve unveiled a new set of rules on Tuesday designed to prevent more bank failures. Let me continue. Dealing another blow to regional banks that could be burdened with more requirements. Now, remember, regional banks are under massive pressure right now because of bets they made in both the commercial mortgage-backed securities side, also in crypto, and they're still reeling from the crash this last year. Thank you so much, Big Chip. All right. It says here, under the new regulations, banks with more than $100 billion in assets would be required to hold long-term debt exceeding 6% of risk-weighted assets or 3.5% of average total assets, based on whichever figure is higher. Another provision deals with the content and timing of submitting resolution plans, also known as living wills, which assist regulators in winding down financial institutions at risk of failure. Let me ask you this. Type 1, if you've seen the Fed be really proactive with banks that are failing, like ahead of time they step in and go, you know what, we've got this. We're going to go ahead and take you over. Or is type 2, if you believe the Fed is completely complicit when it comes to being ahead of the curve, and they sit around and wait for them to fail, and then they allow these other banks, the big banks, to come in with their grubby little hands and pick up these assets for pennies on the dollar. I believe 2 is the right answer, but that's just me. It says the logic behind raising debt levels is that it would provide regulators with an additional financial cushion, so they need to seize a lender. That cushion would help absorb a lender's losses before uninsured depositors, those with more than 250,000 in their accounts, are impacted. Remember, the FDIC is completely insolvent. It made it very clear. It made an announcement late this spring and said, we're done. We need money. So you got to cough it up. And all the banks scoffed at them, especially the big banks. The Fed comes in and goes, hey, FDIC, we get that you're insolvent, but the banks can't take this. So we're going to put all of the onus on the big banks. And the big banks are crying, oh, you're going to make me hold more money. That shows you the total greed. See, the CEOs, the C-suite execs, they don't care about your accounts. They care about their bonuses. And in a world where you can watch a bank crash and the CEO still gets paid out is disgusting to me. But that's where we live. One of the last banks that collapsed in the spring, I'm blanking on what the name is off the top of my head because we're live, but its management was the same management that ran Lehman Brothers. This is absolutely insanity. But hey, that's the world we live in. So if you understand the banking sector is crazy and they just want to rob you with tons of fees, lose your identity and all kinds of cyber attacks, and go, I'm sorry, there's no accountability, then you've got to be proactive when it comes to investing in who you bank with. That says until now, only the biggest lenders had been subjected to minimum long-term debt requirements. The OCC defines mid-sized banks as those with assets ranging from 15 billion to 115 billion, meaning the upper tier of these would be subject to the new debt holding rules. In the aftermath of this year's banking crisis, which witnessed the collapse of several high-profile lenders, including Silicon Valley Bank, Signature Bank, and First Republic Bank, banking regulators have moved to enforce stricter regulations and capital requirements on the industry in an effort to prevent future contagion. The FDIC last month pressed regional banks to change the way they report uninsured deposits, which played a leading role in the crisis. Meanwhile, credit rating agencies, including Standard & Poor's, Moody's, have downgraded several regional lenders and issued negative outlooks for others. Now, remember, when they came out and they said, hey, we're going to go ahead and downgrade these banks, they also said, watch out, because we're probably going to downgrade these as well. Investors, I do not believe Wall Street and investors have fully priced in those downgrades yet. And that's going to add more downward pressure on these banks. Now it says here, the new rules could increase funding costs for banks and pressure their earnings at a time when profitability has soured due to rising interest rates and economic uncertainty. The Fed's rate hike have caused consumers to take out fewer loans as interest rates have spiked. Let me stop right there and say, there's news stories right now out of Fortune and some other places saying that they expect a 10% crash. They're using the word crash or plummet in stock markets once the public figures out that we're in a recession. Once it's official, they say, okay, we're in a recession. And I've said this before, I'll say it again. That is a psychological damaging effect on the public, all right? When you hear, oh, we're in recession, you hear it, you go, okay, well then I must act different, and people regress, they spend less, they change their habits, financial habits. And you have to realize that when that happens and the market takes a 10% hit, well, what happens to bank stocks? They take even more of a hit. Their credit has issues. Their lending costs explode. Their margins keep slamming down and shrinking. And type 3, if you think for a second that the CEOs are going to take less of a pay. Type 4, if you think, oh no, their margins are going to shrink. The CEOs and the C-suite execs are still going to get paid those massive, massive returns, right? It says, however, the industry would have 3 years to implement the rules once enacted, giving banks time to adjust their balance sheets. Now, that doesn't matter, because the second they say they have to do it, they start whining. We saw Brian Moynihan from Bank of America immediately come out and start railing against the additional 2% that he was being told that he was going to have to hold. And he says, hey, I'm the second largest bank in the country, and if you make me do this, I'm not going to be able to compete with other banks. That should have been a huge red flag for Bank of America right there, especially the shareholders. But hey, I'm not a financial advisor. Just a dude with a bro hawk and a dream. FDIC regulators also estimate that regional banks already hold roughly 75% of the long-term debt required under these new rules. So they're saying it's not going to be that big of an impact. The point being is this: the banks are failing. The banks are having trouble. And things like this are only going to ensure that they're going to have more pressure. So be leery, be aware, be diversified. Don't have all your eggs in one bank. Have multiples, because if an ATM goes down, a network goes down, a hack, or hey, we just don't have the money, all you got to do is go to the next bank. Hope you got something out of this. Thank you so much for watching. The Economic Ninja is out.